NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, the agency that, single-handedly, helped America win the space race and accomplish the goal President Kennedy set for his country in the early 1960s. When one thinks about NASA during the agency's glory days of the Apollo program, it's hard to fathom that one of NASA's most notorious controversies happened just 2 years after Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon. What is now easily considered the agency's most legendary manned space program, Apollo became a source of inspiration for generations of Americans and non-Americans. Hailed for its success of beating the Soviets in the space race and landing men on the moon just 66 years after the Wright brothers flew for the first time. Alongside the nearly fatal Apollo 13 mission, the story of Apollo 15 remains a piece of NASA history that the agency would surely rather keep hidden. You're watching The Dig, and this is the story of NASA's oldest scandal, the time Apollo 15 brought contraband to the moon. Following the historic moon landing of Apollo 11, the nation's interest in subsequent moon landing missions started dwindling. Although NASA proved it could land men on the moon again and again, excluding the case of Apollo 13, there was an evident lull in the media's attention and willingness to report closely on future NASA moon landing missions. At the time when the agency's future was highly questionable and when its reputation was hanging on by a thread thanks to the near-fatal Apollo 13 accident, the last thing NASA needed was a scandal. And that's precisely what they got. See, Apollo 15 was supposed to be just another few days of work on the moon for Mission Commander David R. Scott, Command Module Pilot Alfred M. Worden, and Lunar Module Pilot James B. Irwin. Focused on retrieving samples of the Genesis rock, thought to be part of the moon's early crust, and to prove Galileo's theory that objects of different masses fall at the same rate when there is no air resistance by using a feather and a hammer to demonstrate it, Apollo 15 was, on paper, a rather uninteresting mission in NASA's repertoire. And for a while, it really was, until the media got hold of the news that the crew carried around 400 unauthorized postal covers and envelopes to later sell for personal profit upon their return. To understand why what happened mattered so much, we need to go back to the early days of the space race, when astrophilately, the collection of stamps and postmarked envelopes related to spaceflight, started gaining prominence. See, both the USSR and the US issued commemorative postage stamps following certain missions and milestones. In the case of NASA, only the US Post Office Department, nowadays the United States Postal Service, was authorized to issue the creation and distribution of said stamps. So, when it came public knowledge that Apollo 15 astronauts carried privately produced postal covers and stamps, serious issues arose. How the three even found themselves in such a situation is quite an interesting story, because it involves dealers. Not arm or drug dealers, but space memorabilia dealers. Horst Eiermann, the producer of the 400 unauthorized postal covers that flew to the moon, met Hermann Ziegler, the West Germany space memorabilia dealer, in late 1969 on a bus that took them to see the launch of Apollo 12. It's the fact that the Apollo 12 astronauts brought a Bible with them that planted the seed in Ziegler's mind of making the postal covers. The only problem was finding a crew willing to take them to the moon with them. And this is where the crew of Apollo 15 comes into play. Sometime in mid-1971, David Scott and the other two crew members had dinner with the then head of the astronaut office, Deke Slayton, at Eiermann's house. According to Scott, Slayton was a longtime friend of Eiermann's. It's at this dinner, without Slayton's knowledge, that Eiermann proposed the three carry 100 special stamp covers. Scott, a veteran of 2 previous space missions, knew taking anything aboard the Saturn V rocket without NASA's authorization was forbidden, whilst Worden and Irwin, first-time flyers, were assured it was common practice. The 3 were assured that the memorabilia would only be sold following the end of the Apollo program. To make the offer even more appealing, the crew was promised $7,000 each for their efforts, an amount that tripled their monthly pay at the time. Scott demanded 100 more postal covers be produced for their quote-unquote good gift value for their friends and family. All covers were to be postmarked twice, at Kennedy Space Center on the date of the launch and following the splashdown. They were also to carry a signed statement from the astronauts with a certification from a notary to make them more sellable in Europe. Command Module pilot Worden ended up carrying 144 additional covers for his friend F. Herrick Herrick, a retired movie director and stamp collector. Before any of this took place, in August of 1965, Sladen issued regulations requiring astronauts to declare all items they intended to carry, have them approved by him, and ensure they were safety checked for spaceflight if similar items had not been previously flown. As you might have guessed, the stamps and covers carried by the Apollo 15 crew were not declared. In addition, NASA's 1967 Standards of Conduct prohibited astronauts from using their professional position to generate profit for themselves or others outside NASA, a rule the 3 clearly violated. So, although Scott was well aware of the potential problems that carrying contraband to the moon might cause, him and his crew went for it nonetheless. On July 26, 1971, Apollo 15 successfully lifted off. Commander Scott smuggled his covers in his spacesuit. After traveling for 4 days, Scott and Irwin landed on the moon on July 30th, alongside 400 unauthorized covers that spent 3 days on the moon inside the Lunar Module Falcon. Interestingly, Lunar Module pilot Irwin carried 96 additional covers with various designs. Most were honoring Apollo 12, and those that did were brought along as a favor for Barbara Gordon, wife of Apollo 12 astronaut Dick Gordon. According to statements given by Irwin and Worden later on, the 3 were busy signing the covers while traveling to the moon. The stamps were added aboard the recovery ship Okinawa, following the splashdown. A month after the end of the mission, 100 of the covers were certified by the astronaut office. The covers already carried a handwritten statement signed by Scott and Irwin that they had been landed on the moon on July 30th. By early September of 1971, Scott had sent 100 covers by registered mail to Ironman, whilst the remaining 300 were used for private commercial distribution, mostly by the astronauts themselves or their friends and family. By the time the Apollo 15 crew went on an official NASA trip to Europe in November of 1971, NASA had already received word of the suspicious collectibles when a potential customer for one of Herrick's covers contacted the agency to ask about the memorabilia's authenticity. Commander Scott realized the 3 could face serious consequences when he learned that the distribution of the covers began in Europe as well, telling Irwin, quote, "Jim, we are in trouble now. They are starting to sell the envelopes over there," end quote. While in Europe, the crew contacted Ironman to inform him that they wouldn't be accepting the promised money. Howard C. Weinberger, a well-known space memorabilia collector, in his account of the Apollo 15 covers, deemed the astronauts' refusal, quote, "an effort to save their careers and reputations," end quote. But no matter what the crew did after the fact, there was no way of saving their astronaut careers once NASA found out the truth. See, by March of 1972, NASA and Sladen became aware that the Apollo 15 crew actually transported unauthorized covers aboard the vehicle. For Sladen, who spent months supporting the three and, according to author Andrew Chaikin, quote, went out on a limb to defend his people, end quote, the discovery resulted in insurmountable disappointment and anger towards the crew. In the words of Deke Slayton himself, quote, they told me what the deal was, and I got pretty goddamn angry. So I was through with Scott, Warden, and Irwin. After 16 splashed down, I kicked them off the backup crew for 17, end quote. In fact, in July of 1972, the three astronauts were reprimanded for their behavior, making it unlikely they'd ever fly in space again. Author Andrew Chaikin describes the situation like this, quote, the other astronauts were divided in their opinions. Some saw it as simply a dumb mistake. Others thought Scott, as the mission commander, should be court-martialed. To some, it was a gray area. Astronauts had sold their autographs, for example, and profited in other less dramatic ways from their fame. But this time, there was so much money involved, and it had all become so public. It had tarnished the astronaut corps. Whatever the astronauts thought of the SAMP affair, the damage was done. For better or for worse, the myth of the perfect astronaut had crumbled, end quote. Ultimately, Scott, Warden, and Irwin were questioned before a closed session of a U.S. Senate committee, and they never flew in space again. Scott was dismissed from the astronaut corps on August 7, 1972, exactly a year following his return from the moon. He'd later become a technical advisor on the Apollo-Soyuz test project and would lead NASA's Dryden Flight Research Center until his retirement in 1977. Warden went to work for NASA's Ames Research Center in California until 1975, whilst Irwin retired in 1972 and formed an evangelical group. What the Apollo 15 crew did wasn't a quote-unquote supervillain level crime. However, it was an example of disrespecting the agency's policies and hoping hundreds of privately made postal covers and stamps would go unnoticed among space fans interested in collectibles. Ultimately, the decision to remove the three from the astronaut corps was also a warning to others who might have had similar ideas or aspirations. You can try fooling NASA, but you'll end up the fool. In the years to come, NASA would suffer quite a few more scandals and tragedies that changed the agency's reputation and shaped its future, for better or worse. Why the Apollo 15 controversy remains one of NASA's biggest failures is because it came from within the agency itself. The protagonists, however guilty you might consider them, were respected astronauts that NASA had to get rid of following the controversy. It was a sign the mighty agency wasn't as perfect and untouchable as it might have presented itself until then. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more niche and uncharted history topics that are yet to be covered. Until next time, diggers.